I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Office Hours webinar, Compassion in the Face of Chaos and Tragedy, how UVA used Schwartz Rounds to respond to the events of August 12, 2017. I'm Stephanie Adler-Yuan, Director of Education and Training here at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and your moderator for today's session. The Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare is a national leader in the movement to make compassion a vital element in every patient-caregiver interaction, and we're pleased to offer this complimentary session to our members today. Before we begin the formal presentation, let's go over a few details about the webinar. Today's program will be 60 minutes long. The first 45 minutes will consist of a presentation, and that'll be followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. Today's program is being recorded, and for your colleagues who weren't able to join you today, it'll be available on the Schwartz Center's member community website a week from now. Please note that attendees are participating in listen-only mode, but can interact with speakers by using the questions pane, which should be appearing on your screen. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions pane and send them to us, and we'll address as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. Finally, as you exit the webinar, you'll receive an electronic survey that we ask you to take a minute to complete so we may capture your assessment of today's program. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my dear colleague and our host for today's session, Dr. Beth Lown. Dr. Lown is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the medical director of the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's Office Hours webinar, Compassion in the Face of Chaos and Tragedy. UVA used Schwartz Rounds to respond to the events of August 12, 2017. At a moment when it seems we wake up to news of another devastating crisis or tragedy every morning, caregivers are on the front lines of caring for those affected by such events, often suffering great trauma themselves in the course of doing so. In this special Schwartz Center Office Hours webinar, we'll hear from the Schwartz Rounds team at UVA about how they went about planning and facilitating a Schwartz Rounds in the aftermath of political demonstrations in Charlottesville in August 2017. And we'll hear also how the rounds helped hospital staff process their experiences as individuals and as a community. And now I'm honored to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Julie Haizlip is Clinical Professor of Nursing and Pediatrics and is current director of the UVA Center for Appreciative Practice. Julie helped bring Schwartz Rounds to UVA and served as the physician lead for 5 years. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Beth. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Julie. Our second speaker today is Timothy Short, who is an associate professor in palliative medicine at UVA and serves as the clinical lead for Schwartz Rounds. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Beth. Glad to be here.
And completing our speaker roster today, we have Ann Williams, who is the manager of organizational learning and development for UVA School of Medicine. And Ann helped bring Schwartz Rounds to UVA and has served as the facilitator since the program's inception. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Beth. Happy to be here.
So with those introductions, I'll turn the program over to our speakers.
So this is Julie, and to start with, I'd like to provide some background about Charlottesville and the events of August 11th and 12th. Tim will then talk about our decision to hold a Schwartz Center Rounds about these events and the unique elements of planning. Then Ann will discuss the rounds themselves, then each of us will offer a few personal reflections, and we'll open it up for a discussion. So as background, Charlottesville is a bucolic little college town with a population of about 46,000, just over 200,000 if you include the surrounding county. We're steeped in early American history, being home to 3 of the first 5 U.S. presidents. There are two main highways that cross, and if you drive about 15 minutes in any direction, you're truly in the rural Virginia. There are two hearts to our town. There is a vibrant downtown pedestrian mall that's full of shops and restaurants with outdoor seating, a movie theater, and an amphitheater where there are free concerts every Friday during the summer. And the other heart is the University of Virginia. And the university centers around the lawn, which you're seeing in front of you. It's a manicured quad that's surrounded by the academical village, areas where students live interspersed with faculty and deans. And at the northern end is the iconic rotunda that you're seeing. The lawn and the rotunda are hallowed grounds to the university community. It symbolizes the history that we hold dear, and walking the lawn at graduation is one of the most memorable moments in our students' experience at UVA. It's against this backdrop that our controversy rose. The city and county governments had decided to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee from a park that is a block off the downtown mall. This decision had been legally challenged based on arguments related to the importance of history to our community. And it was that decision that attracted the Ku Klux Klan and several other white supremacist groups to our town. In July, about 50 members of the KKK came to protest, and there was a lot of anxiety around that. But it turned out that their presence was dwarfed by many counter-protesters. The event ended with only minimal conflict, and the police were actually criticized by townspeople because they thought the police had overreacted by coming out in riot gear. So our community knew that the Unite the Right rally was planned for August 12th and that the threat for violence was considered greater. But the university had planned a series of lectures on race relations and the Civil War. Faith communities had planned alternative gatherings, and many of us had hoped that a significant counter-protest would have the same effect as it had in July. Most of us kind of had a plan for how we would deal with Saturday the 12th. But what most of us were not aware of is that some of the Unite the Right protesters had plans for Friday night as well. Friday night, a cohort of the protesters gathered and walked the length of the lawn with torches. They were shouting Nazi slogans and racist chants. And while many of us watched in shock, like me, from my television at home, a number of our students actually acted. And it's difficult to discern on this particular picture, but the darker circle in the center are UVA students who are surrounding the surrounding the statue of Thomas Jefferson that is just on the other side of the rotunda in the picture that you were seeing previously. And those students stood in opposition to the protesters, protecting kind of one of the most significant symbols of our university. And I think it was then when most of us realized that this was going to be very, very different than July. So early Saturday morning, many of the businesses on the downtown mall chose not to open. Counter-protests took to the street. Unaffiliated militia groups showed up on our familiar downtown mall with assault rifles. Police and National Guardsmen took position in riot gear. And within moments of when the Unite the Right protesters came onto the scene with weapons and shields, the gathering was deemed an unlawful assembly and people were ordered to disperse. And that's when the violence began. I, for one, watched in horror. I saw people fighting, being hit with clubs, throwing metal newspaper stands and spraying chemicals at one another. And I tried to explain to my children, who are old enough to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing, that something like this could happen less than 5 miles from our home. Everyone in our community knew someone who was downtown. And those of us who are healthcare providers knew what this was going to mean for our hospitals. And then the unthinkable happened. I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, have seen this devastating picture. A car drove across the downtown pedestrian mall, plowing into a crowd of our friends, our family, and our neighbors. But then after that moment of shock, which was witnessed real time by our emergency room staff on a TV that was playing at the charge nurse desk, It was time to do what healthcare providers do and first responders have been trained to do. We walled off our emotions and we cared for the wounded, regardless of what side they were on.
This is Tim, and I'm going to be talking about kind of how we went about choosing this as a subject. And our usual planning committee got together at a time when we, quite honestly, as a community, were saturated with all of this information. Everywhere you went, the talk was about these events. The news every night, every coffee shop, every hallway in the hospital, that's all that was talked about for weeks, literally. And we had multiple town hall meetings about this, and in response to this, we had all kinds of events for our students, our learners, and ourselves. And we wrestled with whether or not to choose this and move forward. We wrestled with the timing, and we decided, you know, it really would be irresponsible not to deal with this head on. In terms of the timing, we really wrestled with, you know, if we did this too soon, it's going to be too raw. If we did it and waited too late, then hearts are going to be closed. And we felt the time was right. We were about 6 weeks after the events that we put on our Schwartz Rounds. We went about this in a very different way than our usual approach. Usually, we identify a case, we go to the trenches of those caring for that case, we talk with them directly, we recruit them as a panel, we hear the stories, and we use those stories to invite stories from the audience at the rounds. This time, we started with administration because there was so much going on. There was so much energy and so much approach to this that we felt like we better go top down. I met with the director of our emergency room and one of our chief trauma surgeons, who's also one of the mass casualty managers or directors, to get permission to do this, because we didn't want to be counterproductive or compete with any of these other efforts. And they were very, very supportive and felt like this was the right time as well. Interestingly, when I talked to the administrative assistants to get to an appointment with the emergency room doctor, he was a career Army guy, and I said, you know, how are you guys doing, when I was waiting at the doctor's office, outside of his office? And he said, well, you know, we're fine. I mean, I know for you, this is a very traumatic event, but in the ER, this is what we do every day. And it's just another day for us. Well, that was not the case with this group of ER docs, as you'll hear as we talk about what went on. We also needed to coordinate, the other thing that was different about this was we usually selected our panel ourselves, but in this case, I asked the ER doctor to make recommendations. I emphasized that we wanted an interdisciplinary team of panelists, as we usually select, and we ended up getting the social worker that was there that day, the charge nurse that was there that day, the ED doctor that was there that day. We tried to get a patient registration person, and it turned out they just didn't work out timing-wise. And then one of our chief trauma surgeons rounded out the panel. We had a lot of growing expectations as we approached this. We really anticipated, we normally have 150 to 200 people at least every Schwartz Rounds, and we had this in our largest hall, expecting record crowds because of the nature of it. Ann will talk a little bit about that. I had media contact us wanting to attend this session, and of course we said no, but that's never happened for a Schwartz Round as well. So there was a lot of buzz, a lot of expectation. The atmosphere was still charged, but was settling. So I'm going to turn to Ann then for to address how we prepped the panel, selected the panel.
Hello, everybody. We really went about this at the beginning like we would have prepping any panel. We set up a meeting. Tim and I both attend. Julie was able to attend this one as well. And we typically give a background of the Schwartz Rounds and their purpose. We listen to the panel stories. We help them highlight things that they want to emphasize during the rounds. We determine the order of the panelists and so on. And that was what we did at this preparation meeting as well. We found the panelists to be very open, very honest. There were some tears shed. The MD who was in the ER that day really shared some of her vulnerabilities, which I'll talk about a little later. And overall, the session went just fine. What was different about it, though, was as the conversation proceeded, we ended up talking about race and racial discrimination. And we didn't go too much into politics, but we recognized, and one gentleman in particular who was on the panel was talking about the fact that there are really some serious racial issues in Charlottesville that people are not talking about very openly. He talked about how after this event on August 12th, after the white supremacists were here, people were saying, this isn't Charlottesville, this isn't us, this isn't who we are and what we represent. But at the same time, other people in the community were saying, oh yes it is. Walk in my shoes for a little while. Come to my neighborhood and let me show you what it's like to live there. So the conversation was talking, in this prep meeting, we were talking about the fact that there are really these two different Charlottesvilles and that we need to be talking more openly about the discrimination that happens every day and even today, of course. So that put us in a different place than any of the other prep meetings we had done. We were talking about very deep and broad personal, political issues. And as Tim mentioned, there were conversations all over the grounds at UVA, within the medical center, the hospital at large. But we've also recognized that the Schwartz Rounds are not meant to talk about race and politics. They're designed for a very different purpose. So we had a really thoughtful discussion with that panel about whether or not we wanted to go there. And we came to an agreement that we really did need to go there, that the issues of discrimination and race needed to be brought up, but in a safe way, in a non-confrontational way, and in a way that acknowledged that that was not the focus of the Schwartz Rounds itself, but it was an element of the dynamic that we were all facing in the aftermath of this tragedy. So we felt like we were ready. We got to the venue the day of the Schwartz Rounds, and the panel was all there. Everybody was excited, and the auditorium began to fill up, but we noticed that it really wasn't as full as usual. And if you recall, Tim mentioned we were expecting a crowd with overflow. One thing I didn't mention too, the other thing that we did, which we had not done, I think maybe we had done for one other round, was we reached out to our employee assistance program and our chaplain and asked them to attend and be available for 30 or 40 minutes afterward in case this was a very, very emotional conversation and people needed a little bit of support. So we had our EAP folks and the chaplain in the audience, and noticed that the auditorium really didn't fill up. And we were really surprised. And as we talked about it then and afterward, we really attribute that to an advertising glitch. Our usual advertising about the Schwartz Rounds never went out. So there was nothing that went out about it electronically on email, except I think one email to the folks who normally attend and are on a Schwartz Rounds distribution list. So it was a little curious that we didn't have as many in the room as we usually do. But we kicked off the session. I always do the logistics and talk about phones and background of Schwartz Rounds, et cetera. And Tim introduces the panel. He reminded people about the purpose of the rounds, that we didn't want to talk about politics, but we were going to focus on the psychological and emotional impact of this situation. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit about how the session went. The social worker started, and she talked about getting the phone call when it was Saturday, when she was at the pool with her children. And she was on call, and they called in lots of social workers, and she remembered being kind of in two places at one time. She had her children there, and she had to figure out how to farm them out to other families or caregivers. And then driving into the hospital, she recalled how surreal it was almost to see the people, the signs, the chaos on the streets, the downtown mall closed off. And she also talked about what touched her the most was, I don't know if you all recall, but there was one young woman who died as a result of this event. And she recalled the social workers, two of her colleagues, walking arm in arm with the mother of this young woman, and staying by her side, walking with her, talking with her, actually escorting her to her car that day. And she said it filled her with tears, but it also gave her great pride in her team. The charge nurse on the panel, she was interesting. She was all about the logistics. She was triaging patients. We set up a triage actually in the hospital lobby. They were talking about how they were dividing up the rooms. They had to be careful about who they put together in a double room. You know, did they put somebody that was on one side of the argument in the same room with somebody who was on another side of the argument? And she stayed in her head pretty much the whole time, even during the prep session. She was very much in her head. The emergency room doctor really talked at a bit deeper level, certainly in the prep meeting and then also during the rounds. The only patient she treated that day was the young woman who died. And unfortunately, that was a short encounter because the woman came in really bad condition. So our MD talked about how she just went into work mode then. She stayed focused on the patients, on treating everybody. She talked about how they treated people, of course, no matter which side they were on, no matter what symbols they were wearing on their shirts. The physicians and nurses and techs and everybody went on their business, regardless of those things. And she also had to come back the next day, which was Sunday. And she said she went home and she felt okay for the most part. And then she came in on Sunday morning, and there was news going on all the TVs that there was a potential for gunshot violence that day. There was an impending news conference coming up. It was being shown on the TV, and all of the broadcasters and security, police, et cetera, were preparing for a gunshot battle at that conference. It didn't end up happening, but she, for the first time, kind of had to sit down with tears in her eyes and say, I don't think I can do this again. I don't think I can go through this another day. The last thing I want to talk about as far as the panel is just the other trauma surgeon who Tim had mentioned, who's also part of our administration. He talked a lot about how the hospital prepared, and Julie will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But he was the one who brought up the concept of discrimination and the idea about two different Charlottesvilles. And he talked really openly and really honestly, and everyone in the room was listening very, very carefully. And I did my usual thing. I turned to the audience and I invited them into the conversation to ask questions, share their stories. and the audience was completely silent. I have a 10-second rule. I counted for a full 10 seconds before I asked another follow-up question, and nothing. I waited the full 10 seconds, and I made a very conscious decision to let that silence just be for a moment. It was very different, and it was moving. As a facilitator, it was a little awkward, but I let it be. And the one person who broke the silence, I'm going to let Tim tell you that story.
The one person that broke the silence was the person that was supposed to be on the panel. And as is often the case, you know, often what follows silence is profound. And this is a young, very petite, beautiful patient registration tech who stood up and said she was from Venezuela, from Caracas originally, and she's grown up amidst violence all of her life. She's run and hid in houses from bullets flying. She's run and hid in crowds from men and others chasing. She's known violence since being a little child, but living in Charlottesville, she wasn't ready for violence to come there. And it really rattled her. She kind of gave voice to what was resonating underneath a lot of the process of that. And that did open dialogue from the audience there. But as I think Anne said earlier, and I think the word is really, really apt, there was careful conversation from the audience. It was almost, I wouldn't say calculated, but I think we were all afraid to kind of let ourselves go any deeper, which raised the question that we were wrestling with. Was this too soon? Was this too late? Or maybe it was the right time. So what we'd like to do is turn to reflect on kind of our takeaways and our reflections from this Schwartz Rounds. Julie will start.
So I think that one of the things that was very interesting to me was, you know, our Schwartz Center rounds are, you know, despite the fact that they're large, they generally manage to feel very intimate. But one of the primary things our panelists wanted to talk about that day was the pride that they felt in their response. As Anne mentioned, in the prep session, we learned a lot. And one of the things that we learned about is how carefully the hospital had been planning for this event for more than a month. They had set up a new system where they could send out a blast page and find out from everyone how quickly they could be there if they were needed. A command center was established. There was a plan for where ambulances were going to arrive and how people were going to be triaged. All elective surgeries had been rescheduled to make sure that there would be ICU and floor beds available if necessary. And actually a number of both the ED and the surgical faculty just came into the hospital and worked in their office so that if they were needed, they could be there in minutes. So all hands were on deck and the system worked. And so, you know, it was interesting how much they wanted to stay there. You know, they did get around to some of that, but they really, you know, I expected that, you know, there would be some raw emotion, and it didn't really surface, and that surprised me. And what I told Tim and Anne afterwards is that I really wanted to go there. I felt like I needed that. I needed to feel the camaraderie. I needed to feel the connection with the other people in our health system. But then I realized that I hadn't actually been there that day. I had experienced it, but I had experienced it as a community member. I called in and said I would come in if someone needed me. Didn't have, you know, I wasn't one of the people that was needed. But I as I was sitting back and thinking about this presentation, I wonder how I would have felt had I actually been there.
I'd like to share some of my reflections here too. And I have to say, as we've got together to prepare for this, I didn't realize how I needed this. I needed to revisit this again. And I think one lesson I take away from this is not a one and done. This is a process that unfolds. And all of us come into that readiness at different points. And so I think that's partly what we experienced when we didn't have the numbers we expected. I think a bigger part was advertisement, but I think there were just some people they're not ready to have discourse or to go there. The people that led us probably most profoundly were our students in the beginning of healing. This picture in front of you now was painted overnight, that night that the events occurred, when you got up and the sun rose. This is a bridge that the students paint constantly for advertised activities, et cetera. It's right on the edge of campus. And this message was, I think, spoke the hearts of many, many Charlottesville residents. I think in many ways, it's our most vulnerable population that probably starts the healing process. They invite us in, they give us permission to be in the suffering, to open our hearts to the pain, and really just to slow down and allow ourselves to feel. And in this way, the students really helped us. What they did next was they led us as a community to reclaim that space of the grounds of the campus that we call grounds that had been violated. They started where the rally had started on Friday night, and they marched those same steps, and they marched up to that statue of Thomas Jefferson and the rotunda, and they reclaimed that space. They reclaimed that space in unity, in song, in silence, and with a profound sense of peace. They, I think, helped us quite a bit begin to heal. We were all worried about our learners. We were all worried about our students, yet they showed us the way in a lot of ways. Another reflection I'd like to share is personally, I've only been in the clinical lead role for a year or so, having inherited it from Julie. So I felt really, really responsible for this. I had expectations for this, quite honestly. I really wanted this to be an effective, profound, healing, transformative session. And, in some ways it was all of those, and in some ways it was none of those. And what it taught me was I needed to let go of expectations and let this be what it was meant to be. Our usual metrics for whether or not a Schwartz Rounds is successful, of course, we get the surveys returned and the ratings, et cetera, but we usually gauge it on how many people were there. How was the engagement? Were people tearful? Were they moved? Did we move from the head to the heart? And then on all those counts, it fell well below all our expectations. But I think the session did offer a healing. In some ways, I think it allowed us to pause, to reflect. That silence that Anne talked about, I think it offered us a solitude that revealed community. And I came away not feeling proud of being part of UVA, but feeling really grateful of being part of UVA. I have to tell you too, I was meeting with a close friend of mine the week before the event, this Schwartz Rounds, and telling him about it, that we were going to have it. He was very, very involved in the events. He was down there on the mall. He had to flee with all that was happening. he still was struggling to find perspective in all of this, and he wanted to come. And I said, well, no, it's a closed session. But it made me realize how much the community needed this as a large, and how much we needed to be community, let this be a bigger part, that we are a part of the bigger community. I was actually not in town for the events. We were on vacation in northern Michigan, and my wife and I just stopped in our tracks when we saw it on national news. I watched it with my mother-in-law, and she's 93. She lives with us with some early dementia, and she couldn't make sense of it. She just watched it, and we all were locked in. And Deb, my wife, and I were devastated, but Gramps just watched it, not able to make any sense of it. And it wasn't until I kind of walked away from that experience that I realized I was watching it very much like Gramps. You know, I don't think you can make sense of something like this. So from a personal perspective, we're all still trying to find our own ways through this into the healing.
And this is Anne, the facilitator again, and I will just say, as far as the rounds went, I think in reflection, we talked about how big this topic was and is. It goes so far beyond us, beyond the emergency department, beyond Charlottesville, et cetera, that I think, as Tim said, we couldn't expect to tackle it all in one Schwartz Rounds. But people were looking for answers after this happened, and there are no answers that we can provide in that forum. So I think a lot of the struggle that people were having during the rounds and after the event, during the rounds, and still is that internal struggle of how to make sense of this. What do we do to help fix this? And all of those questions that are very profound and larger than what we could certainly address in this round.
And this is Julie again. And I think, the one thing that I do think we can say is that it was very therapeutic for the people on the panel. They spoke to us afterwards, and they needed to give voice to some of the things that they were saying. And when we talked to one of the panelists, we had said, well, how are you dealing with this? And she said, I wasn't. I boxed it up and I put it away. And this is the first time I took it back out. And so I think at this point, we'll turn it back over to Beth, and we'd be happy to talk about anything you want us to talk about.
Goodness. Thank you all very, very much. I felt like I was right there with you through every stage of what people saw, your beautiful photos, the planning. It's really incredibly moving. Thank you for sharing that story and so much of the detail of what you all experienced. Really, we're grateful to you. It's hard to know where to begin. I mean, certainly you were trying to address an issue that has now, it's part of our history. The two Charlottesvilles, the different worlds that we live in, whether because of race or religion or gender or all the other ways that we perceive ourselves as being different. It is a question that not one person can answer, and I'm just reflecting on the role of something like the rounds in trying to help people deal with its manifestations in such a profound way. I do have some questions from the audience. They feel very like in my head too, but I'll go there because people pose them and they want to have us think out loud about them. But one of the first questions we did get was about this issue of how long do you wait before you hold a rounds, a Schwartz Rounds, on a topic like this, or one, that has affected the broader community in such a profound way. So I know you said you did them after 6 weeks, and you discussed this and debated. I guess in looking back, would you recommend doing something differently? And, what are your thoughts about the timing as we think about this today?
Well, we typically wait longer after an event. We usually have a kind of a 6-month rule, and we always check in with people around the case to make sure how they're feeling about it. And a lot of times it's simply too raw, and that's really clear. With this one, we felt like it was so important to talk about, and so in your face almost, that we just felt like waiting would not have been the right thing. Now, in retrospect, we don't know how it would have been if more people had come, which is one unfortunate part of it. I think the emergency department wanted us to go forward. People we talked with, everybody actually resoundingly said, yes, we need to talk about this. This is a great forum to talk about this. So I'm not sure that we would do it any different. Tim or Julie?
Yeah, I think the other factor in this, I think the timing was right, personally, because what was starting to happen in our community and in our medical center was we were starting to jump to solutions. And I don't think we had processed enough before we could come to the right solutions. We were starting to want to fix. And I don't think we had stopped. I don't think we had dropped down into being with this in a deeper way to really have the right solutions. So I think I think the timing was right.
That's very, very helpful. I think, there's no right or wrong. It's really a community decision, a local decision. And you use the very best judgment that you can, and you use your feelers about what's going on, in the hospital, in the clinics, in the community, to try to make these kinds of decisions. So, yes, I think what you're saying rings true to me as well. We did, after the Boston Marathon, the Schwartz Center ran a series of rounds, and for the first time we offered regional rounds in the wake of the marathon bombings, and we did decide to wait 6 months, but we were offering it to a very different kind of an audience, not a local audience, but people could come and attend a round at different locations across Boston and in Western Massachusetts. Was that the right solution? Who knows? It felt a little bit different because we weren't dealing with a group that was trying to come to grip with the immediate aftermath like you were. I also wanted to mention, I had forgotten to mention this, but we wanted to make our audience aware that there is an incredible video that our colleagues on the panel here sent and is making available for us all to look at. It will be available on the Schwartz Center website along with the recording of the webinar when that is posted. The other thing is that we will send out a link in follow-up to those who registered to attend the webinar, so you'll get it that way as well. I wonder if we can move to some more of the questions that came up. And here's a question that I think is really important, and that is, how can you heal when this event keeps being brought up over and over and over again in the 24-hour news cycle? It's very hard to set it aside when it's so so omnipresent because of our social media and every other way we learn about such events. So what would you say about that? Did this present a problem? Did you feel that people were almost being continuously re-traumatized because of the media cycle?
So this is Julie. I actually have a couple of answers to this, and one is my own, and then the other is a little bit off topic, but I think very relevant. So, you know, to answer for myself, I don't know how many of you saw, but apparently in Tennessee, there was just another one of these rallies within the past week or so, maybe 2 weeks. And when that showed up on my news feed and I saw one of the people that was prominent in the protest here in Charlottesville, and it really took me aback. It wasn't, you know, just seeing his face again. He was someone who had shown up in multiple of, you know, the pictures and the videos here in Charlottesville, and to see that he was there doing it again in some other community evoked a lot of emotion in me. And so it is hard to heal with these kind of continuous reminders, and it's also hard to heal when, you know, the event in Vegas happened and then the event in New York just happened, and, you know, as you mentioned at the very beginning, these tragedies seem, you know, to almost be commonplace now. And one thing, this isn't the second point, but something else I wanted to mention is that, you know, when all of this was going on, one of the things that the charge nurse mentioned is that the people from the ER from the Pulse shooting in Miami actually sent pizzas to our ER staff. And then our ER staff ended up sending pizzas to the people in Vegas. And so there's kind of this pay it forward. We know what you're going through in ways that other people might not. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is kind of the difference in the experience of the ED physician and the trauma surgeon. The ED physician said that she had, you know, very clearly made an intention. She did not want to know what side people were on. She wanted to kind of keep that out of her, you know, vision. She didn't want to be biased in any way. And so she had kind of made that conscious decision. And when she mentioned that, our trauma surgeon said, you know, I would have loved to have had that as an option. But after I took them to the OR, I had to take care of them the next day and the next day. And we had to know, because unfortunately in our hospital, we still have semi-private rooms and people were getting put in rooms together. And so, you know, it was even kind of continuing in our own institution. And we had to be thinking about it there beyond just what was seen on the news.
This is Anne. I do want to say, I mean, my first reaction, how do you heal, is, well, you really don't very well. Because, and I mean that in almost a good way, because it has created so much more dialogue around the issues. And we will be having leadership summits that are focusing on diversity and inclusion and education on discrimination in the environment. And there are posters and signs all over our grounds now about tolerance and inclusion. And so I think it is will be a very, very long healing process.
I hear that, and guess what? I will again share our experience here in Boston. It's sad, isn't it, that we're now being able to share these experiences? But we did a follow-up rounds at the one-year anniversary, realizing that people may have anniversary reactions. And we found that at the very first rounds, that people were really talking about their immersion in this experience, their disbelief, their, how to say it, I mean, their sense of trauma was very, very, very present in the initial rounds. And then at the 6-month mark, we were surprised, but shouldn't have been, that it was still very much there. But there were also people in the audience who were able to speak about their growth, how this kind of event had really made them question their beliefs, their assumptions, had led them to reflect more deeply. In some cases, had even caused changes in how they had people had decided to live their lives differently, prioritizing what was most important to them. It's really a conversation about post-traumatic growth in some ways. But I think you're right. I'm not sure people heal. They learn how to manage. They learn how to think about such events, either more deeply or in different ways. We have more questions. I think we have time for maybe one more. We could probably speak forever about this, but the questions are, I'm trying to decide because there's some wonderful questions here. There was one person who asked, how do you feel now about the questions you had before the rounds about addressing the emotional, psychological feelings associated with a political issue in Schwartz Rounds? Do you feel any differently than you did before when you were sort of debating, is this the right forum and shall we go ahead?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough one. That's a really good question. And I think, again, to be able to speak with any clarity, I think you have to deal with your emotions first. And I think that's what we've all realized in this process is we're all on different journeys along that line. I think this Schwartz Rounds historically at UVA has been such good leadership with Julie and Anne. They've created an environment where it's safe, where it's really, there's outstanding participation, there's confidentiality that's assured. Of course, there's always good food. But we've created an environment where people come and feel safe. And so I think this was a really good venue to kind of stop and pause and process this. I think probably the most profound moment of that session was probably the most important, and that was that 10 or 15-second period of silence that we shared as a group. Because the silence that we had previously shared was in horror, we were in silent horror. But here we were reflecting together. There was a sense of unity in that room that I think people left with. So I think this is a good forum to move forward on.
Yeah, I don't think we would have done the topic justice without going into the race and discrimination conversation, because it did have direct impact on our caregivers. And one comment the same emergency room doctor made was that some of the other caregivers were kind of relishing being on one side or the other. They were relishing ripping off the white supremacist t-shirts and things like that. So some of the dynamic was the caregivers being able to express their outrage at things. And I think Tim's comment was really important, that it provided a great sense of community and a great sense of social justice, I would say, in the room, knowing that we have a long way to go to enact that on a daily basis.
Our trauma surgeons, our trauma surgeon that was on our panel is African American. He had a group of probably 10 trauma surgeons. You saw some of them in one of the slides, and there wasn't one single white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in the group. There were 2 Jewish individuals, 2 or 3 Muslims, 3 or 4 people of color. I mean, these were the very people that were being singled out.
Being targeted, but
Yes.
they were the ones that were giving the care that day in
Yep.
the emergency room. And the irony of that really struck a chord with everybody as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think we could have done it justice.
Yeah, this is really difficult. When we have to pull out our professional selves and just push forward, it's very difficult, and then it all sort of hits us later on. But it's amazing. It's amazing that our professionalism carries us forward in this way, and it's a gift to have something like the rounds where you can stop and reflect. I'm amazed. It was really a 10 to 15-minute silence.
No,
No.
seconds.
10 seconds. Yeah, no, 10 to 12 seconds.
Oh, okay.
And our rounds typically are very interactive, and we have to cut off the dialogue a lot. So it was just really different that people were not immediately raising hands to ask questions or make comments.
Well, I think we have to wrap up at this point in time, and I just want to thank you all for sharing your experiences with us and the thoughtfulness with which you planned the rounds, with the discussions you had, really the heartfelt reflection and discussion and dialogue that went into this planning and then carrying out the rounds, and your willingness to share it with us. We are very, very grateful to all of you. I think I will turn this over to Stephanie to wrap up the program at this point. And once again, our heartfelt thanks to you.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Really, thank you so much, Julie and Tim and Anne and Beth, for the beautiful moderation. What a wonderful conversation. So thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to participate. Again, if you had colleagues who weren't able to join, we will have the webinar posted on our member community website in about a week's time. If you need help logging in, you know where to find us. We hope you found today's session inspiring and beneficial, and we hope you'll join us for future office hour sessions. We are planning another one for December, so look for news of that in our member newsletter and on the website. And I know how eager everyone is to get back to your day, but if you could take a minute on your way out of the webinar just to complete the survey and give us some feedback on the program, we would appreciate that enormously. So that's it for me. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.